Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for tonight's event. We have with us John Tresch and Paul La Farge to celebrate Tresch's new book, The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science. Firmly establishing a scientific idea is not entirely different from the ways in which one tells stories. When Thomas Kuhn developed the idea of the paradigm shift, he explained that new scientific discoveries do not only upend old ideas in terms of how the scientific community functions, paradigm shifts also reassemble the very language which constitutes day-to-day life. Edgar Allan Poe, inventor of the detective story and master of horror, was someone who constantly assembled and reassembled the language of his world. While he's known for his fiction, he was equally committed to cryptography, cosmology, and the rating scientific questions of his day. In The Reason for the Darkness of the Night, John Tresch brings a new, incisive perspective to Poe's life. Tresch inextricably ties together the peak of Poe's thought with the emergence of modern science and Poe's contribution to it. In fact, Tresch's book can be read twofold, as a book on Poe and as an expansive history of modern science's birth during the early to mid-19th century. Among other subjects, Tresch writes about the reactions to photography's invention, as well as the innovativeness of the University of Virginia's creation. But at the forefront of the book is, of course, Poe. And Tresch writes that Poe argued that every word and image in a poem or tale should contribute to a single, deliberately chosen effect. An argument that, in my eyes, parallels the language that builds a scientific model. It is a very unique book with praise this week from the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the New York Times. A little bit of more information on our speakers today. John Tresch is a professor of history of art, science, and folk practice at the Warburg Institute in the University of London. And Paul La Farge is the author of the novels The Night Ocean, The Artist of the Missing, Houseman or the Distinction, and Luminous Airplanes, which continues as a large web-based hypertext. He has also written a book of imaginary dreams, The Facts of Winter. Just a reminder that there will be a Q&A at the end of the event. So if you have any questions throughout the discussion, please email them to Evan, E-V-A-N, at 192books.com, and we will make sure to read them at the end. Thanks so much, and without further ado, I will pass it on over to John.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks to 192 for hosting this, to everyone who's tuning in now, and thanks to Paul for joining me in this conversation. I'm very happy to be talking about my book, and I'm going to start with a short reading. And given the constraints of the medium, I also want to enhance that with a small magic lantern show or a PowerPoint, just a few images to go along with the reading. And I'll start with this picture from Poe, a Poe that you may not recognize. Here he is, not the kind of shattered individual haunted by his misfortunes in his familiar daguerreotypes, but a young man full of the future in 1845, just after his poem, The Raven. The passage I'm reading comes a little earlier than that, from around 1842, when Poe is in Philadelphia. Philadelphia called itself the Athens of America because it was the largest center for scientific activity in the US. It also was a place of industry, invention, printing, publication, and mixing among all those different fields. And Poe was very much in the middle of that mix when he was in Philadelphia. And it was a period when he had a lot of happiness and a lot of success, especially as the editor of Graham's magazine, where he took this magazine from the start of 5,000 subscribers up to nearly 50,000 in just over a year, which was the largest circulation of any publication in the world by some accounts. So as editor, as reviewer, as author, he filled its pages with really sharp, really fascinating material, and people wanted to read it. He was also relatively happy in his domestic life, living with his wife, Virginia, pictured here, and his mother-in-law, who was also his aunt. Virginia was his cousin, enjoying themselves on Locust Street in Philadelphia. But in 1842, that changed. Playing at the piano, one day, Virginia broke a blood vessel and began coughing up blood, and that was a sure sign of consumption. And of course, there was no cure for tuberculosis. After that, Poe made some very extreme decisions, one of which was quitting Graham's magazine, and then in the middle of an economic depression, and was on his own. In this period of great uncertainty, fear, and sadness, he started a series of stories for which he's extremely well remembered, the ones that really have seared themselves into the minds of readers ever since. Tales of torture and guilt, like The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, the Mask of the Red Death. So 1842. In the fall of that year, Poe was working on his masterpiece of morbid suspense, The Telltale Heart. The tale revived the observation drama of a descent into the maelstrom with grisly, malevolent twists. Though it used the language and imagery from the sciences, Poe gave readers an experience not of certainty and reassurance, but of disorientation and horror. Its famous first lines invoke truth, nerves, disease, hell, and the power of the storyteller. Opening in the middle of a conversation, perhaps an asylum visit or a trial, the narrator boasts of the sharpness of his senses. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calm you I can tell you the whole story. The speaker has become fixated on the opaque eye of the old man who shares his house. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell on me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man. He proceeds with cool, objective detachment toward an irrational goal. With patience and precision, he stalks the man, peering into his room at midnight, with a lantern open, just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. On the seventh night of this death watch, the old man awakens, sensing an intruder. After an agonizing silence, he stealthily opens his lantern until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and full upon the eye. At once he hears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton, the beating of the terrified old man's heart, so loudly that he fears neighbors will hear. In its detail and regularity, his description mimics the report of a meticulously designed scientific experiment. Light, long a symbol of knowledge and reason, is here associated with madness. The view of Poe's narrator is filled by a film-covered eye, not the perfectly adapted apparatus taken as a sign of God's wisdom in natural theology. The darkened room recalls the camera obscura, the technical core of the daguerreotype, an enclosed space into which images of the outside world were projected. Yet the light that pierces the room is artificial. The image projected is not the external world of creation, but the thread of a spider ensnaring its prey. The tale restages one of the primal scenes of modern science, Isaac Newton's experiments in the optics. There, Newton detailed the steps through which he carefully cracked open a shutter to let in a single ray of light into a darkened room and dismembered it by passing it through a prism, revealing the colors of the spectrum. Poe's tale inverts Newton's experiment, making vision and methodical reason the agents of perversity and death. He flips the heightened sensitivity celebrated in new precision instruments into a pathology, allowing the narrator to perceive many things in hell. He murders the old man. Methodical as ever, he dismembers the body and buries its parts beneath the floorboards. The police arrive. He coolly entertains them, offering refreshments, placing their chairs directly on the guilty floorboards. He then begins to hear, once again, a constant beating, like a watch wrapped in cotton, his dead victim's heart growing louder and louder. The merciless pounding and the indifferent chatter of the police drive him to a frenzy until at last he cries out in horror and agony, confessing his crime. Just as his desire to demonstrate his rational calm led to the uncovering of the murder, his heightened senses gave him access to sounds that took him beyond the limits of normal experience. By detailing an act of violent irrationality in the language of scientific method, Poe dramatized the dark side of the Enlightenment, a vision uncannily familiar to Americans enmeshed in a so-called rational economic and political order defined by ruthless competition, slavery, and violent settlement. Though usually presented back to them in soothing tones of equality, freedom, and progress, beneath the appearance of calm reason pulsed veins of terror, obsession, and cruelty. Poe gave the screw another turn. While the heart beneath the floorboards might symbolize the narrator's criminal madness, the monstrous guilt that his reason and patter cannot mask, it also echoes the ultimate symbol of method and rationality, a mechanical watch, the embodiment of Newton's clockwork universe, and the icon of natural theology and the argument from design. The tale peels back a layer of reason to reveal inexplicable, irrational forces. When another layer is lifted, these forces are revealed as instruments of a deeper mechanism with a reason all its own. It also made for a damn good read. The tale has terrified school children and delighted adults since its publication. And here's Poe as he appeared in 1849, as we remember him now.
Thank you for that wonderful reading here. I'm going to put a little clap reaction up here and suggest the other people clapping on the YouTube channel. I have a number of questions for you, although I feel that the section that you read addresses some of them. And so I think I might start with a general question, which is, having written this wonderful book, do you feel that Poe is worth taking seriously as a scientist, as a figure in the history of science? Or does he belong to the history of literature, and does he, happen to have had a couple kind of brushing contact with science here and there?
Well, I write as a historian of science, so definitely I think he belongs within that history. The usual way in which someone would answer that question in the affirmative would be by citing the scientific achievements that he actually did make. He wrote a very well-read summary of conchology, the study of shells. That was the best-selling book in his lifetime, a textbook that was sold on the lecture circuit of natural history, and was really well-grounded in the science of its time. In his last work, or one of the last big works he wrote, Eureka, is a cosmological essay about the origins of the universe and the ends of the universe as well. And it wrestles with astronomy, with the birth of stars, with nebulas, and comes up with these statements like space and duration are one, which some physicists have looked back and said, wow, this is Einstein. He has other arguments that sound a lot like the quantum mechanical multiverse. There's also a very good argument that can be made that the vision of the history of the universe that book Eureka includes, where everything starts from a single particle and rapidly explodes outward, is the origin, or one of the many origins, of the Big Bang Theory. And in fact, the people who came up with that, Friedman and Lemaitre, would have known Poe's theory. They would have known Eureka. So it's entirely possible to read him into that history of science, a history of discoveries that lead up to the facts and the theories that we take as true today. But the angle that I take is to read him into that history in a slightly different way, because at times he's contributing directly to this progress of discoveries, but at other times he's critiquing what he saw as a rather limited approach to the questions of the natural order or the order of the cosmos. That was what was being advanced at that time, a kind of limitation to the merely empirical or to very, very simple forms of induction. He saw science beginning to rule out the possibility of intuition or leaps or aesthetic judgment. And for him, that was quite a step backward. So as a critic of science who's extremely engaged with what's going on, very aware of the developments of the science of the time, he's a really important voice in a wider history of science.
And that brings us a little bit to the historical context in which Poe lived and worked, a lot of which had to do with abolitionism and the run-up to the Civil War. And one of the points that you make very eloquently in this book is that Poe's critique of science is also a critique, I think, of the neutrality of science, of the objectivity of science, as a way of avoiding engagement with complex and dangerous, from some point of view, moral problems such as slavery. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that dimension of his work.
Yeah, it's an extremely complicated one, but yeah, I think it's really important for the period because it's 18. He lives from 1809 to 1849, and in his lifetime, the debate over slavery is really beginning to heat up, and abolitionism is becoming a much stronger political force, just as the slave powers are getting more and more of a grip over Congress and extending their reach. And his work appears in this context. And I read his view, his broader view of science, exactly as you do. I kind of take from him this recognition that science as a kind of pure understanding of a detached observer is a kind of misrepresentation of what really goes on. Science is very much engaged with politics, very much engaged with material activity, very much caught up in the debates between people, and it's also not at all resolved. There's a politics to it. That said, Poe himself was very deliberately neutral on the issue of abolition and slavery. He spoke. He didn't write directly one way or the other, and that was a kind of careful stance that the critic Terence Whalen has argued was necessary for his main project, which was to build a national audience for American literature. He didn't want to take a side on that question as a way of making sure that he'd have readers both in the South and North. And he was raised in the South. Many of his main allies were from the South. And in a way, that same use of a kind of objectivity or detachment to remove scientists from that debate was also a move that he made to remove himself of that debate. So he offers the critique, but he also himself can be held to that critique. The critique applies to him as well.
Sure. Although I'm just thinking of an instance of this critique in your book where you're talking about Poe's story, The Man Who Was Used Up. And you say, well, Poe's tale showed the self-made man, the free citizen, and heroic frontiersman of Jacksonian diplomacy as a fragile contraption held together by publicity, stagecraft, and slave labor, which feels like a very kind of trenchant critique of the American myth and of the kind of mythic image of America and American expansion that you showed an image of in your talk just a minute ago.
Yeah, very much. And so he lived during what's called the kind of rise of Jacksonian democracy. And this was in many ways Jackson supporting the common man, and that was white men. And it was in favor of slavery. It was about advancing slavery. It was against the established powers, but it was also supporting only a small sector of the population of the US. And I think in that story, The Man That Was Used Up, it's the story of a journalist who goes to meet this great General A.B.C. Smith, who is a great enthusiast for the progress of America through all kinds of inventions and discoveries, scientific and technical progress. And he's a hero of the great Indian wars against the Kickapoo and the Bugaboo, which is a sort of ginned up, imagined boogeyman. And he discovers when he steps into the room of the general, that the general actually has been completely butchered during these wars. He's got artificial arms, artificial legs, a wig, an artificial apparatus that allows him to speak. He's basically a robot who his servant, his slave, puts together to allow him to speak. And that's exactly how I read this. That this is a critique of this Jacksonian hero. It only works if there's someone behind the scenes or someone relatively invisible, and that's slave labor, that's the fragile technologies of publicity to hold it all together. I very much think this is a critique of that ideal and of the kind of claim of endless progress that's associated with manifest destiny. However, Poe doesn't make it entirely explicit. It's there as a subtext. And a lot of the kind of critiques, one way or another, against technology for technology, against science for science, that Poe makes are buried in subtle, complex ways in his stories and are very, very hard to tease out. Very, very hard to tease out as a kind of single position as well, because he's extremely mobile in his thought and in his positions.
Do you think that contributes or even underlies the humor of Poe's stories?
It's a big part of it, yeah. That there's always a kind of wink. There's always a kind of irony. There's another text working below the surface. Paul Lewis is a scholar of Poe who's argued that even the horror stories, which can be extremely gripping and quite frightening, if you read them in a certain mood, they're also kind of over the top. I mean, they're kind of a self-parody. It's very hard to know when to take Poe seriously, and when something is meant in earnest, and when it's a critique or a joke or a satire. And yes, there's a humor to that. It's a kind of grimacing humor, though. It's a humor as the funeral parade goes by. It's a graveyard humor.
Yeah, for sure. I think about all of the kind of ecstatic and feverish language of the fall of the House of Usher, or the really unpleasant body horror that ends the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, when the subject of the story disintegrates, and Poe is very eloquent about the disintegration. And
Into
I wonder,
a pool of unutterable putrescence.
yes, which obviously goes straight from Poe's brain into the brain of my guy Lovecraft. But let's set that aside. I wonder, this is something that just crossed my mind as you were speaking, John, whether in that attempt to shock the audience, to sort of lead them down this garden path of scientific language, of cool detachment, to a place of horror and disgust, whether Poe is practicing a kind of criticality. I'm fishing here, but I wonder whether there was something in his mind as he wrote this that said, I'm going to make you think. I'm going to push you to a place where you feel revulsion, and maybe you'll think about something.
Definitely. And one of the, I mean, it's there in the passages of the Telltale Heart in a kind of exaggerated form. He's insisting how calm, how methodical, how patient he is. And that language, which is in his period becoming a real kind of general currency, that we can solve all the problems of politics, we can answer the questions of the universe, we can resolve all the mysteries of existence if we simply apply a very calm, methodical approach to the world. Just observe the facts and then follow the inductive leaps to discover the general theories. And that, for the first time in the history of the world, that way of thinking is taken on as a general substrate to reality. More and more people say, yes, this is just the way the world is. I mean, we now live in a world that inherits that. We take science as, the one of, if not the primary and basic way to understand the world. But that's a new language at Poe's time, especially in the way it's begun to spread. Mm-hmm. And in highlighting that methodical aspect, that patient, neutral, calm observation, and then leading you gradually, step by step. It's very much in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, the manuscript found in a bottle, the Telltale Heart, leading you step by step, right off a precipice, right off a cliff, into disgust, horror, humor. He's showing that this is only one layer of reality, and there's the entire ocean of reality that goes beyond it. So yes, I think there is a kind of critical, there's everywhere a critical intent in that use of his language.
It's almost as if, Poe is saying, look, if you were to see the world as it is, clearly with a scientist's mind, what you would see might horrify you, right?
That's almost a literal Lovecraft quote.
That is, of course. Well, let's push that aside again. I want to come to a question about the subtitle of your book, because by calling it Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science, and using that word forging, you're talking obviously about a kind of foundation, a kind of institutional and epistemological creation, but there's also the idea that science is being forged the way one forges a check, and ideas about deception and hoaxing run through this book. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for catching that. So on the one hand, yes, it's the moment when a number of practicing scientists realize that there are not yet working national institutions to allow Americans and American science to compete on the international stage, because there are only really local publication networks. There isn't any authority or national academy, national university to say this is real science and this is not. These are the pretenders and these are the real scientists. And I follow in detail a handful of the scientists who, step by step, with a kind of conspiratorial project, build the institutions, lay the foundation, forge the institutions that will create a national institutional framework infrastructure for science. It's Alexander Dallas Bache, who's part of the Coastal Survey, Ben Franklin's great-great-grandson, Joseph Henry, the first director of the Smithsonian, Benjamin Peirce, who's the head of the observatory at Harvard. Working together, they get federal funding to create these institutions that will be led by themselves and their friends, who they believe have the proper background, the proper approach, the proper training in science to decide what is and what is not science. And the reason that they're doing it in this period is in response to the other kind of forging. The reason they're forging science is because of the other kinds of forgeries that are everywhere in the public sphere. This is also a period of massive expansion of the press. It's a media revolution that's really directly comparable to what we've all lived through in the last 15 years. Suddenly, there's much more printed material available everywhere, easily, cheaply, from every possible direction than was ever available before. And it means that it's incredibly hard to know who's saying what you're reading and whether you should believe that person. There's a culture of cutting and pasting of reports from all over, putting them together and then sending them out. So the question of authority over knowledge is very much up for grabs. And it's also a moment of all kinds of popular shows and spectacles. P.T. Barnum's just down the road from Poe when he's in New York with his famous hoaxes like the Fiji mermaid, but there are many others on the kind of traveling circuit of the lyceums who are giving shows on electricity, chemistry, mesmerism, phrenology, speculative astronomies, and it's great entertainment. It's incredibly interesting, but is it true? There aren't yet the authorities or anyone to turn to. There's no American Association for the Advancement of Science until 1848, the year before Poe's death, to say, well, what do the scientists think about this? And so there's a great possibility for quackery, charlatanism, humbug. And Poe sometimes writes with the people who are forging the institutions. He's very convinced that America needs to create new kinds of cultural institutions to regulate and evaluate what's good literature, just like it needs to be done for what's good science. But he also participates in the kinds of forgeries and hoaxes that Barnum is honing to a fine art.
Right. And you have Poe, you quote Poe as writing, I think in a book review actually, as a literary people, we, by which he means Americans, are one vast perambulating humbug. We are a big collection of hoaxes and forgeries. And I wonder if there's a way in which Poe serves as a link between the one kind of forging and the other, or if he serves as a kind of illuminating presence to make us aware of the ways in which the very respectable forging of institutions is not different from the very disreputable forging of quack science and, snake oil salespeople.
And thanks. I mean, that's exactly where I think he is, that in his mobility, in a way, it's a forced mobility. He can't hold down a job. There's an economic depression. He's moving from city to city, taking work where he can, selling stories where he can. He moves from subject position to subject position, from story to story, even within story. Within a single story, he's taking on all the different perspectives of his period and weaving them together in these discrete objects that are very hard to see as a whole. But what that mobility reveals is these two positions that are there as kinds of extremes. The elite scientists who want to bring it all to order, to bring it all under the control of well-organized institutions run from above. And on the other hand, the entrepreneurs, the speculators, the hoaxers, who see this as an opportunity for a great deal of fun, a way of making money, a way of pulling the wool over people's eyes, a way of testing out different kinds of hypotheses. Mm-hmm. And he moves between both camps. He's in both of these camps. And there are traditions in the history of science that focus on one or the other of these. That either it's a history, this period is one of the building of these institutions, or it's one of complete lawlessness. And Poe allows you to see how those are completely in conversation. They're responding to each other. And as you say, they're actually using the same kinds of methods to advance their claims. I mean, the same kinds of literary methods, the same kinds of social methods, the same kinds of media methods.
Right. And there's something in your history of Beisch, is that how his name is pronounced?
Yeah.
And his colleagues founding the American AAAS and then the National Academy of Sciences, which has a faint odor of humbug to it, right? It feels like a scheme for procuring federal money and controlling its distribution. It's hardly a selfless enterprise.
It's a very craftily designed, practical project to make sure that their idea of what science is will succeed. And it's very well backed up in the social networks that they have in Philadelphia, in Boston, and New York, to line up the supporters, the scientists who are their allies, and then eventually federal funding to make it possible. And it's a conspiracy. I don't know if I'd say it's humbug, because ultimately what they're doing is securing for themselves the ability and the power and the authority to be able to say what is and what is not humbug, right? So it's sort of, if it's humbug, it's like meta humbug, it's like super humbug, in the sense that it's beyond, it's the power to draw the line, which in a way is absolutely necessary, right? There has to be some kind of final authority. Otherwise, it's going to be a complete chaos of claims, like is happening in the press in post period. And this is, we've seen it ourselves. It's a socially based authority, but it also follows some standards which they themselves set up as the ways of saying what is and is not believable science. And so Poe has a certain respect for their procedures, both on the social level, on the kind of political building of the institutions, but also on a kind of methodological level. They are making discoveries that may not be the ultimate truth, but are useful solutions that practically solve locally focused questions, locally focused problems.
Right. So if they determine that the coastline follows such and such a path, that's where the coastline is. And if you want to navigate, their maps will come in handy.
Exactly. And if they've drawn that line somewhere and a ship crashes, well, they better draw that line again. I mean, they are testing it against the world, and Poe very much respects that kind of experimental outlook, and at least empiricism has its uses, right? He's not someone who thinks there are no facts in any cases, but in order to build them up robustly, it takes the same kind of patience and really unity of effect as he sees is necessary in a poetic work, in a scientific work. It takes that same kind of testing of possibilities, of uniting and making coherent of claims to make a scientific claim stick. And the world is there to test it. The world is there to prove it wrong or not.
I'm thinking about something else that you wrote in the book about in that relation to sort of Poe and the scientific process or the scientific method, because one of the points that I understand you as making is that Poe sees that mode of thinking as necessary but not sufficient, and that there has to be a place where one goes beyond that way of seeing. And I was thinking about the sentence, Poe was extending factual material processes to the point where they blurred into the speculative, ethereal, and spiritual, teasing life and thought beyond their own limits, which is a wonderful description of Poe. But I wonder, how does that sit with you as a historian of science? Is that just an aberrant or invalid practice to sort of take science and then go beyond it to some ecstatic, ethereal other world?
Well, I'm sure different scientists would have different answers to that question. And I think part of what Poe points out is that science succeeds and it really has such resonance in our culture and such lasting power, in part because it has two ways of arguing and of representing itself. One is it's the storehold of everything that we know and of all the established truths, right? So in a way, it's the thing that draws the limit and lays the foundations. But on the other hand, depending on who the scientists are talking to or how it's thinking of itself, it's also the kind of set of practices that extend those limits, that launch further, that go beyond those limits. So I think there are scientists who in the morning will identify with the first, which is it's all about what we already know. But then in the afternoon might say, well, or more like at night, well, it's all about pushing beyond that and seeing, well, what we thought was stable matter, for instance, in the case of physics, is actually a lot of space. And even the particles filling that space may not be resolvable into any kind of fixed location, that's the history of physics in the 20th century. And that kind of leap beyond the known and leap beyond the kind of commonsensical, I think a lot of scientists would recognize and claim as what's the most valuable part of what they do. But I think the power of it is that they have both of those, a very conservative and then a very kind of adventurous side to them. And Thomas Kuhn, who Victoria cited, I think, presents a similar argument about how science works. And in a lot of ways, I think Poe is on that frequency.
Yeah, that he seems to have bridged both of those spaces. He's sort of a morning person and a night person. We've been talking a fair amount about science and the history of science. I want to talk a little bit about the biographical aspect of your book, because this is, among other things, a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. And I want to circle back to something that you were saying earlier about the enormous multiplicity of Poe's work, which I've certainly noticed. Not only did he invent the detective story, but some people credit him with inventing the horror story and inventing science fiction, and he's writing criticism, and he wrote a treatise on the philosophy of furniture. I mean, he's into aesthetics. He's really all over the map in some way. And I wonder if that breadth of or scope of interest comes in any way from his childhood, from his upbringing, which was kind of fragmentary and weird.
Yeah. I think there's, if we want to get psychological, there's a real kind of lack of a stable identity in Poe, and there's certainly a childhood source to that. He's born of, his parents are actors, which in the early 19th century was a morally suspect job to start with. In Boston, their plays were not legal a few years before she showed up there, and they were itinerant. They traveled from city to city. His father was an alcoholic and was sort of laughed off the stage. His mother died when he was 2 years old. So some very early memories, but not a really strong basis. And then he's taken into the house of John Allan in Richmond, who's a very rich trader, or he becomes a very rich trader, who trades tobacco and other goods between England and the South and Virginia. And there he's raised not as a poor traveling actor, but as a member of the Southern aristocracy. He's given the expectation that he's going to inherit millions and inherit the plantations and the slaves and the stocks and the entire business of his foster father. And so he's given that kind of education. So he really sees the highs and the lows economically of the US. And then he gets kicked out of the house. He's never adopted. He's kicked out of Allan's house for racking up gambling debts at the University of Virginia. He joins the army under a false name. He winds up in West Point Military Academy, gets kicked out of that as well. Basically, at that point, Allan disowns him entirely. So the sense of a kind of stable social location or identity or family structure, totally absent for him. And I think that's, it's a very persuasive way of reading the multiplicity, the many different voices and many different personae that he adopts in his writing. But another part of it is poverty and the media environment. So he's struggling to get to feed himself and his family. So he's taking all the jobs he can, writing whatever he can, trying every means available and inventing new ones to kind of make a splash, to produce an effect in the audience and in the reader, which then will build his reputation, build his name. And that means writing many different kinds of things in a space where there's several different genres of magazine, journal, newspaper. He's writing in all those genres, in all of those different types of publication. He's kind of suiting himself to every available platform, and there are many, many new platforms available at the time. And he never has the time to kind of tie it all together until quite late in his life to say, here is the Poe oeuvre. And that really only happens after he's dead. That a collected works that has his poems and his short stories and his criticism. It's Rufus Griswold, his famous frenemy, who ties that all together after his death.
Do you see that kind of, I wonder if Poe is making that kind of synthesis when he writes Eureka toward the end of his life, or whether that's...
I like that thought. I think there is an attempt to kind of leave a final statement, and I start the book with that book, that lecture, which becomes a book that he's convinced is going to revolutionize metaphysical and material science. That after he's finished it, he tells his publisher, we need a run of 50,000, and the publisher says, we'll start with 500, and even those don't sell. It's such a strange book, and there are many people who are huge fans of Poe who've never read it because it's so strange, because it's so difficult. But the things he says before and after it give a really strong sense that in 1847, near the end of his life, he can see it coming. Virginia's died. He's been very, very ill. He wants to make a kind of final testament that ties together what he's been doing, his ideas, his philosophies of composition, of science, of knowledge, but also of literary and artistic composition, his aesthetic views, everything he's learned in all the sciences, all the arguments he's had with different critics and with different experts. He wants to bring it all together into kind of a massive cosmological and even religious testament of this is how the world is and this is my place within it. But the difficulty he has in pulling that off, I think, goes back to that same kind of itinerant and really fragmented existence and identity that he lived his whole life. It's a very difficult text. I wouldn't say it succeeds in Poe's terms, but it's a kind of incredible text as well, that he even tried to do it, and the posterity that it's had, the effects it's had on readers afterward.
Who are the people who've been influenced by Eureka?
Paul Valéry, for one. Baudelaire translated it. We know Poe thanks to his French fans. It's Charles Baudelaire who read him in 1846 and said, this is the modern literature. It's got science, it's got speculation, it's got symbolism and imagination, all combined in this incredible laboratory. Baudelaire translated it, wasn't that much of a fan, but Valéry was a fan. And now in the 20th century, there are physicists, astrophysicists, chemists who are looking back and saying, this anticipated all of the new physics. Relativity, quantum mechanics. Sometimes that seems a bit of a stretch, but he certainly did think thoughts that not many people had thought before and tied them together in this cosmological framework that was in many ways new. I show that there's a lot of cosmological debate at the time that Poe's writing. People are really interested in the origins of the universe, and that has to do with the relation between science and religion. There are challenges to Genesis that are there in evolution, that are there in the theory of the formation of stars. So it's a kind of crowded marketplace of cosmological thinking, but Poe's response to that setting, the way in which he ties this all together based on his own thinking and his own established theories and ideas, is totally unique and totally strange.
And totally strange. And it comes back in a way, I think, again, about that word humbug, right? Poe has a great sense the constructedness of things.
Yes.
You could think about the world as having been constructed. You could think about the story as having been constructed. But if you understand the world from an aesthetic point of view as being a beautiful creation, all of a sudden the ground of simple material reality kind of drops out from under your feet, right? And you're in this space of constructs and ideas and ideals.
I think that's very much how Poe sees things. Matter itself is a kind of construct, and it is a construct which resists. You can't do whatever you like with it, but you can do a lot of things that haven't yet been imagined out of it. And if you peer really into its underlying structure, it kind of dissolves. And that's being said in the physics, the natural philosophy, and the chemistry of the time. The idea of energy as a kind of unitary force that is without any kind of solid point, that's showing up already in the philosophy of physics. And he takes that idea and runs with it. But as you say, part of what is really striking in what he does is he links that to the aesthetic theories that he's so steeped in. So if light, electricity, and magnetism are just different forms or translations of a single ineffable force or spirit, well, then whatever form it takes, whatever form this spirit or energy or principle might take, creates the entire world and can take all the infinite variety of the world. There's a kind of malleability, a self-constructedness, a naturing nature that's aesthetic as much as it's ontological or epistemological. And Poe's theories of how one makes an effective poem, how one constructs or composes a poem or a story, inform his understanding of how God constructs, weaves together, composes the world. So Eureka winds up being quite theological, although it's not at all a Christian God, not at all a familiar God in any way. It's a God who is identical to the universe and whose kind of work of creation is identical to the work undertaken by scientists and by artists.
Right. And I'm going to have to wrap up my questions in just a second to allow room for the Q&A, but maybe I can squeeze in just one more, John. There's something I've been thinking about as you've been talking is Poe's emphasis on the idea of effect rather than meaning. Poe is very concerned with the effect of his work. And if you look at a poem like The Raven, its meaning is a little bit enigmatic, but its effect is enormous, right? Its sound and its kind of its musical qualities and the rhymes that saturate it are fantastic. And I wonder whether that idea of effect, almost instead of meaning, that privileging of impact over hermeneutics has any bearing here, whether there's something that science borrows or learns or could learn or could think about from Poe's way of thinking there.
I think of it as Poe learning from science, but one could go in the other direction. I mean, there is the sense, there's Faraday is producing effects. The natural philosophers are testing what happens when you mix different phenomena or different elements together, just seeing what happens. And effects are being named after physicists around this time. It's a kind of way of investigating the invisible or investigating the unknown. And Poe is very much taken by this view and this kind of physiological basis of it, because the way you know that is through the senses, which are entirely fallible as well. So there's a sense that these poetic experiments follow the technologically grounded scientific experiments that are really visible in physics and visible in mesmerism, which kind of crosses the aesthetic and the physical. It's the science of hypnotism where the senses are brought into direct contact with the kind of invisible fluids and forces that unite the world. Whether scientists can learn from that, I think, is a great question. I think it would be effects replacing substances rather than effects replacing meanings would be the kind of comparable transformation.
Right.
Which I think is, like a lot of process philosophy sounds a lot like that. It's not about what things ultimately are. It's about what they do when they interact with other kinds of beings.
Right. And now I think we probably do have to move to questions. Evan, I don't know if you want to. Aha, okay, so I'll read a couple of questions here from the audience. Brenda asks, when did this project start, John? And when did you know you had a book on your hands?
The project started shamefully like 25 years ago when I borrowed the science fiction of Edgar Allan Poe from my friend Aaron. And it's a Penguin collection by Harold Beaver, and it's amazing. And I didn't know how to make sense of it. And then I just kept reading. When did I know I had a book on my hands? A couple weeks ago. But I wanted to read really, I found certain themes and certain ways of thinking and working that went across all of Poe's work. I wrote a few articles on different pieces, but it always seemed necessary to tie it all together. And now, I mean, finally, I have. So I've given it a shot.
We have a couple more questions here. Linda asks, you said you write as a historian of science. Which authors and/or historians have influenced your work most? And are there any other authors working now who examine the history of science and literature similarly to you?
There's a field of science and literature and media studies. Catherine Hales, Bruno Latour, Simon Schaffer, Peter Gallis, and Lorraine Daston. These are all people that I read quite a lot and still read and talk to. And Jim Secord's book on vestiges of the natural history of creation really is a model in so many ways for what I'm doing. It's writing about a cosmological work that Poe is responding to, though it's focused on England. I kind of am wanting to tell the American story. Yeah, there's a lot of it out there. Do a search for art and science, history of art and history of science. And I'm particularly interested in historical figures who are also interested in these kinds of mergers. So romanticism, natural philosophy, Lovecraft, science fiction authors, and scientists who read and write fiction.
I'm going to jump to another question. Lauren asks, this is a great question. Is the difference between the detective story, investigation towards resolution, and the horror story, investigation revealing the frightening or unknown, almost the same difference as the scientist in the morning and the scientist at night, as you put it before?
Yes, great. That sounds great. Although in his detective stories, the Dupin stories, he brings about the resolution. He finds the answer. He finds who the culprit is, or he corners the minister correctly. But there's a real art to keeping a mystery to that I think Poe is very good at. You're not quite sure how he did it. You're not quite sure that anyone else could quite follow those same steps to arrive at that same solution. And maybe the converse of that in horror story. Yes, you wind up not being able to assemble a world after you've kind of gone off that cliff, but there's a method to it. There's a proceduralism that allows you to arrive at that place beyond procedure. So the kind of analysis and creation always go hand in hand for Poe, and they're kind of the morning and the evening exercises, and the mystery, the detective, and the horror. It's a great question.
And it comes back a little bit to that idea of effect, right? Because without both parts, there would be no effect. Without the morning rational part, the other would be incomprehensible. And without the horror part, the other might be dull.
Yes, definitely. And it's in a way, it's using a procedure to produce something that's never been seen before. That's effect. That can be horror, but it can also be using procedure to find a solution that's already there.
Good. I'm going to ask another question. James asks, which of Poe's contemporaries, American or otherwise, do you feel have similar views on science and technology? Hawthorne, Melville, Conrad, and Dostoevsky, for varying reasons, seem like similar skeptics of progress and the limits of scientific advancement. But are there others on Poe's frequency?
In his time and place, I mean, he has a good rapport with Whitman. of all people. Thoreau and Emerson, although he has a lot of clashes with Emerson and a kind of different attitude, the merging of the kind of introspective, psychological with the external, transcendent, and mystical. That's Poe is kind of the lost transcendentalist in a lot of ways. He's on the same ship, but he's kind of hanging on the back. And Thoreau is reading the same scientists, practicing the same surveying that Poe gets training in at West Point. So I think there's a way to approach a lot of 19th century literature, which has been set in this kind of separate category, as something that's really merged with science. Poe, because of his kind of radical movement, his kind of incessant movement, allows you to see a lot of the connections that some of the more canonized authors who are purely literature are hide a bit. But once you start to pry that open, Hawthorne's obsessed, of course, with daguerreotypes and chemistry and the consequences of science. You start to see that they're all there, that they're sharing in this conversation. I think Poe is kind of more extreme in every direction, though. And that's part of what makes him fascinating. It makes him paradoxical, it makes him contradictory, but he believes the science more than a lot of his contemporaries, and he doubts it more than a lot of his contemporaries.
We have only a couple of minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions. One is, Chris asks, as you researched this book, what was the most surprising thing you found? Was there something you found that didn't quite make the cut for the book, but that you wish had found a way in there?
I'll have to think about the cut. The most surprising thing was I've talked about this book, Eureka, which is about the history of the history of the universe as kind of a machine and kind of a poem. It shows up after he's written The Philosophy of Composition, which is his theory of how to build a poetic automaton, like what are the rules for making poetry. It explains how he wrote The Raven, and he answers in a very mechanical way. Between those 2 essays, I found a reference to something called the Eureka Machine. It showed up in 1845 in an article that Poe easily would have read, almost certainly read, and it's a machine for producing verses, for writing poetry in Latin. And the author says this is an illustration of kaleidoscopic evolution, which for him means mixing in a kind of random way to produce new kinds of beings. So between the kind of idea of poetry as produced by a machine and the universe as a kind of poetic machinery, the Eureka Machine, with the same name as that book he wrote, was there. And I haven't seen that connection made before. It blew my mind. What have I left on the ground? I don't recall. I burnt it all. I burnt all the rest.
All right, I'm going to condense a question from Harry and just ask, are there authors working today that you feel are especially linked to Poe's tradition? And let's just leave it there.
Well, I mean, part of why I'm so happy to talk to you, Paul, is that I think you are. I think you're so steeped in the tradition that grew out of him, especially on the European side. So that's such a pleasure. I'm so grateful to you for talking to me. Rivka Galchin, who I'm so pleased, blurred my book. She's definitely working with us the same questions of uncertainty, of knowledge, of self-inquiry, and uncertainty about the world. There are lots of others out there. I certainly look in science fiction as a place where the kinds of things that Poe is testing are happening. I'd have to give it some more thought, though. Thanks for the question.
Can I piggyback on that and ask whether you think Stanislaw Lem, if you're familiar with his work, would fit into that tradition?
Absolutely. And there are some great studies comparing the two, Poe and Lem, and absolutely in the kind of imagining of alternate worlds and the kind of architecture of those worlds, and thinking through literature as a space where that can happen. I mean, Philip K. Dick, absolutely too. His ways of working, which go back to Lovecraft, and a lot of Lovecraft goes back to Poe. And there's an amazing book that came out last year by Eric Davis called High Weirdness, which is about a lot of experiments in the 1970s that are in. Philip K. Dick is one of the figures, Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna, who are drawing on Lovecraft, drawing on science fiction, and are kind of dealing with some of the same cosmological uncertainties as Poe. And Bolaño, yeah. Bolaño is a big, literally a worshiper of Poe. He says you should read Poe on your knees.
And maybe we can read Poe on our knees. We could read, John, we can read your book seated in a respectful position. I think reading it on our knees might be painful in the long run, but it's a wonderful book. And I hope that those of you who are watching and listening will read it if you haven't yet. That about ends our time here. John, I just want to thank you for giving me a number of things to think about. So I'm going to go take a long, meaningful walk and try to make sense of the universe in these terms.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for your questions and for the conversation. I hope it has a good effect on you, the walk that you take. Thanks Victoria, and thanks Evan, and thanks 192 for being here. Thanks for hosting this, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. Thank you.
Thanks again to John Tresch and Paul La Farge for that wonderful discussion. It was really fascinating to see Poe in a new light, and I love the idea of a calm, detached language leading us off a precipice into a state of disgust. That was really excellent. A recording of this event will be posted immediately afterwards, so if you missed the beginning or you want to share it with a friend, it will be ready immediately after the streaming is finished. All of our previous events are available to watch as well. So you can just go to the Paula Cooper Studio website and you'll see an archive there, and you can watch all of the events on that website. If you'd like to reserve John's book, send us an email at info@192books.com. You can also come to the shop for safe, socially distanced browsing every day from 11 to 6 and until 7 on Fridays and Saturdays. Another option is ordering from the bookshop.org page for direct shipment if you can't make it down to Chelsea. Please sign up for our email newsletter or check our website, 192books.com, for more information on our upcoming events. Next week on Tuesday, June 22nd, we do have an event with Charles McGrath on the new Library of America edition of Donald Barthelme's stories. So we're really excited for that, and we hope you join us. So until next time, one more thank you to John Tresch and Paul La Farge, and thanks for joining us, and have a great night.
Thank you, Victoria, for putting it all together.